Hello, everybody. It is Friday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, assistant sports editor for multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Back for our weekly Penn State football podcast with Joel Haas of the Daily Collegian and our Post-Gazette Penn State intern for this coming season. Joel, it's been a big week. We had Penn State Media Day. James Franklin, his coordinators, lots of players spoke after a long summer as they get into fall camp. We're going to get into everything that was said, all the interesting things that were said, all the interesting things that we might be able to infer. Talk a little bit about the new coaches poll that came out this week. Maybe get into some house settlement and what it might mean for Penn State's roster, Penn State NIL. Before we do, just want to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast, Voodoo Brewing Company in State College. Enjoy world-renowned craft beer, delicious cocktails, and our almost famous lobster rolls at Voodoo Brewing State College Pub, located right off College Avenue and Route 322 at 201 Elmwood Street, State College. VBC State College has something exciting going on every day of the week. Join them this fall on Mondays for weekly free play cornhole tournaments, or test your knowledge with pub trivia every Tuesday at 6. Wednesday is their game night featuring board games, card games, and adult games. Every Thursday, your boy Dots hosts bingos, but this is not your Nana's bingo. Saturday, they have the Nittany Lions and college football on all day, and they finish things off on Sunday with brunch paired with the Steelers, Eagles, and Red Zone coverage. Can't wait to see you at the State College Pub of Voodoo Brewing. Check it out today. Joel, I want to start with this. It seemed like the big cliche that everyone wanted to throw around, both the coaches and the reporters asking them the questions, was getting the ball in the best players' hands, and how that is a big area of emphasis this season. That amused me because, you know, they had their best players last season, and you know what, the question I had was, were Penn State's best players good enough last season if you had the ball in their hands to make plays? I think that, to me, I guess philosophically, before we get into some of the other comments, that seemed to be more the problem last season, was, especially in the case of the receivers who we're going to talk about in a second, they just weren't good enough when they had the ball in their hands.
Yeah, I think it was interesting because we saw a lot of times last year in the bigger moments, Penn State tended to rely on the pass, which is really confusing to me considering they have two of the best running backs in the country and one of the probably a pretty average wide receiver room, maybe even below average. I think people would agree on that. So it was interesting to me that especially in big moments, they tended to rely more on the pass and kind of went away from Nick and Katron. And I mean, I know when you're down, you know, multiple scores getting later into the game, you obviously kind of have to pass just because of the timing of the clock and everything like that. It's the kind of situation that you're in. But still, there were moments where Allar was throwing like 50 passes and completing, you know, maybe half of them, less than half of them in the big games. And it was just confusing why he was getting that many attempts, why they insisted on continuing to call for passes. And I get that, you know, you want to maintain that balance where you want to keep the defense kind of on their heels. But I mean, that was just confusing at times. And I thought it was really interesting how open some of the coaches were to saying that. I know Franklin has mentioned it a few times now. And then Jaywan Sider, the running backs coach, kind of said the same thing, how he felt like last season was kind of a lost season because they didn't utilize the running backs. And I mean, the stats bear that out as well. Both Nick and Katron were down from where they were in their freshman seasons, and you would think that freshman to sophomore year is kind of the biggest jump in progression for a player. And they actually regressed in stats, which is interesting. And again, just kind of goes to show that they went away from the run a little bit. And I'm not sure why they did that.
Well, and it's not like they were behind a bunch of scores in a lot of games, Joel. I mean, they were in that Ohio State game the whole way. They fell behind late, but you know, there were a lot more opportunities to use those guys, and it was working early on. They just got away from it for reasons that were, you know, somewhat inexplicable. I think the Michigan game was the same way. It was one of those games where they felt like they were a lot further behind than they were. And maybe that's, you know, the pressure of playing a Michigan, you know, at play where, you know, okay, you're down one possession, but it feels like three possessions. And so you feel like you got to throw maybe more than the scoreboard suggests. But again, I mean, they weren't destroyed so badly in that game that you should have become one-dimensional as quickly as they did. And even the Ole Miss game, that was more of a run-and-shoot game, but I don't even know if you can really count that in terms of, I mean, Mike Yurcich was fired by that point. And same with the Michigan game. He wasn't around, and that, I think, is you know, they weren't behind. So why were the play scripts like that? But specifically, I do want to get into the receivers because it was the second thing James Franklin was asked about on Saturday. He seemed pretty confident with this group. Kaden Saunders, Amari Evans, Tre Wallace, Liam Clifford are some of these guys that you want to have hope for, but didn't really get to show it last season. How do you feel about, I guess, that core group of four there below Julian Fleming? Because I think a lot of people are, taking as something of a fact that Julian Fleming is going to be pretty solid and that he's a somewhat proven commodity. Those guys are not. How are you feeling about them?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, everyone outside of Julian Fleming is pretty much a question mark right now. We've heard good things about a few guys, but then again, it's not like the coaches are going to be saying bad things about the receivers. Harrison Wallace, I think the coaching staff is expecting to push for that wide receiver 1 spot. And he's a guy who did flash last year. We saw some good things from him. But again, injuries kind of kept him off the field, and overall his stats weren't great because of that. So, yeah, I mean, Penn State's obviously hoping for him to take a big step up. I personally would expect kind of a breakout season for him if he's able to stay healthy this year, which is kind of the big question mark. And then, yeah, moving down the line, Amari Evans is another guy who's kind of flashed at times, especially in spring games. But, we haven't seen it as much in actual games. Liam Clifford, potentially a guy that could step up in that slot. And, Kaden Saunders, same kind of deal there. That kind of battle for the slot receiver will be pretty interesting, I think. But yeah, I mean, I think Penn State has, these are, 4-star guys who we've seen the potential because they've flashed at times in certain games. They've had trouble staying on the field and just had trouble getting open. But I think one of the things that we're hearing from Kotelnicki and from some of the players is that this scheme is going to allow them to get open. It's going to create chaos for defenses. It's a lot of both pre-snap and post-snap movement. Just a lot of, eye trickery, eye candy to kind of get the defense to bite on certain things. So they're hoping that they'll be able to kind of scheme the receivers open as opposed to the receivers having to get open on, just juke moves and speed and things like that. But the scheme should help them get chances to get touches on the ball. And, we've seen that they can pop. I think of the Michigan State game, for example, where that felt like kind of the height of the offense and really the potential that it has. And again, you get most of those guys back. You're losing Keandre Lambert-Smith, obviously, but you bring in Julian Fleming. So there, you could argue it's basically net even. But yeah, I think the potential is there. And I think it's less about the wide receivers development and more about the scheme that's going to allow them to really excel this year.
Are there any of those guys that you feel good about in particular? I think you mentioned Tre Wallace, but let's just take that other group of 3 of Saunders, Evans, Clifford. I know there's been a lot of talk about Saunders specifically in special teams. Do you think that translates to, confidence that if you get the ball in his hands, in more, conventional sets that he's going to be able to do things with the ball as well?
Yeah, I think Saunders is going to be really dangerous in space, bubble screen slants, things like that, where you can kind of get him the ball on those quick hitters and then just let him work. He's got that speed to burn. That's why they have him, as a returner. And we've seen that he's also been able to put on weight. I think last year he added like 25-ish pounds, something like that. And actually we've gotten to talk to him a few times. And basically the whole thing was when he arrived on campus, they thought he was way too small to play. So that's kind of why he wasn't able to find the field. But he's really done a good job kind of adding weight. And, he's a smaller guy. But he's really been able to add on that weight, which I think was the biggest thing keeping him off the field. I think the staff was more worried about him, potentially getting injured or things like that. And now they feel more comfortable putting him out there because the speed's always been there, the route running, the hands, everything like that. He's a good wide receiver. That's why he was so good at the high school level, a highly rated recruit. And just coming in, he just didn't have the size that I think the staff felt comfortable putting him out there. But now he does. So I think he could be poised, another guy who's poised for a breakout season, especially like we mentioned in Kotelnicki's scheme, where he's going to try and get guys open, using motion, things like that, to try and scheme guys out in the field. And if Kaden Saunders gets the ball in his hands with grass in front of him, he's always a threat to get a big chunk play.
Yeah, excited to see how they use him and how that maturity is coming along. I know you were in the scrum with Drew Allar. I think, a big talking point in the spring was he seems more confident within this Andy Kotelnicki offense, the whole process. That there was a demeanor change to him from the fall to the winter and the spring. Did you see that carry over on Saturday when he was, speaking with reporters? And is that aura that he's had about him, for most of the last 6, 7, 8 months, is that still there?
Yeah, for sure. At times you kind of have to stop and question what was Mike Yurcich doing, just because of how different everything looks now, and how much talent the team has on offense, how confident they are now, and just the way that they kind of carry themselves. Aller said that one of the big things that the team is doing now is actually the offense will pick a specific player and have them go in front of the team during practice, and then kind of break down film, on the big screen in front of the team, and it works on their public speaking. They have to talk in front of the team and kind of present these plays and things like that, and then it also helps them with just understanding schemes and building up that football IQ. But that's one of the things that Kotelnicki's done, just for example, to kind of build up the confidence within the guys, get them better at public speaking, kind of things like that, build that camaraderie. So just think it's small things like that that I think are kind of adding up. And I mean, Drew has said it himself. He's more of an introverted guy, more of a quiet guy, kind of just puts his head down, goes to work. But he realizes that he plays quarterback. And when you play quarterback, you have to be loud. You have to command the offense. And he's working on, doing a better job of that. And I think the results will be there this year.
Did you find it interesting at all that when Franklin was asked about Drew Allar, he talked about Beau, Pribula, Jaxon, Smolik, those guys first? I mean, those guys are always on the tip of his tongue, those backup quarterbacks. I don't think, I read the transcript of the everything, and it wasn't until like the 7th or 8th paragraph that he got around to mentioning Drew Allar. It was a couple sentences, but he was talking a lot about the backups. I mean, James Franklin really likes these backup quarterbacks. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think part of it is just kind of like a classic Franklin tactic where you bring up the starters. He wants to talk about the backups just because in a world of transfer portal, in a world of NIL, he wants to make sure that those guys are getting praise, that they know that they're valued within the program. He doesn't want to risk potentially losing them if they kind of, fall out of the spotlight and things like that. So he always wants to, talk highly of his backups and make sure that they know that their work is being recognized and things like that. It's kind of a common theme that he'll do with pretty much every position group. So it's kind of difficult to tell whether, these guys are legitimately maybe going to push for a starting job or something like that, or if he's just kind of making sure that they know they're valued, making sure that they know, they're wanted here and trying to keep them from transferring away to another school. I mean, Beau, for example, obviously in the same class as Drew, you kind of start to wonder, maybe is this guy going to think about transferring potentially so that he's able to start somewhere? Because if he waits for Drew, either entering the draft after this season or after next season, he's going to have 1 or 2 years of eligibility kind of depending there. And that's if he doesn't get passed up by someone below him on the depth chart. But if we are getting into the quarterbacks, Smolik, I mean, Franklin has said good things about the way that he's kind of coming back from his injury, but it sounds like he'll be out for most of the season. Franklin never confirms the timeline, but he will tell us if it's kind of a long-term thing. And he did say that he'll be out for, a long period of time. So we don't know exactly when he's back, but for now it's true freshman Ethan Grunkemeyer who's getting all the reps at QB3. And honestly, I think that Grunkemeyer will be the future of Penn State, potentially even next year after Allar's gone. I've seen videos of him throwing, seen him at practice a little bit. He looks confident. He looks like he has a size, and he was a highly rated recruit. I think the number 10 recruit in the country per 247. So I think Grunkemeyer is probably the future of Penn State, and Franklin's obviously been complimentary of him, the way he's kind of been able to step in and not really have that, not have any struggles kind of moving up to the college level. It was more of a seamless transition for him. So I'm pretty high on what Grunkemeyer will be able to do in the future.
I want to pull at that thread. You said when Allar's gone, you think this is it for him, regardless of how things go, or what's your read on that situation? Because especially in this age of NIL, I wonder if he takes a step this season, but it's still not like first round grade. Is he going to want to just go into the draft and get with a team, or is he going to want to maybe come back and flash some stats and potentially vault himself to the top of the draft?
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, I definitely think it's still up in the air as of now, and it'll kind of depend on how this season goes with Penn State. But he certainly has the talent that, NFL scouts are looking for. Just kind of those raw physical traits, good size, big arm, things like that. And everything else is kind of something that, you can work on once you get to the NFL level, maybe develop for a year or two. But yeah, I mean, I think if he wanted to go to the NFL after this season, I've seen that he's already getting some first round buzz just based on that kind of raw talent that he possesses. But I think it'll really depend on a few things this year. I mean, obviously his personal performance, the numbers that he's able to put up this year. I think if you're Penn State, it's an interesting situation because the better the year he has, the more likely he is to leave next year, which you might not want. So you almost want to thread the needle where you kind of want a good season from him, but you don't want it to be too good that he leaves for the NFL and then you have to find a new quarterback going into next season. So it is an interesting position, and I don't think it's decided yet or anything like that, but there's definitely a chance that he does leave for the NFL this season. And I know that he's gotten some buzz as, a highly rated draft prospect.
Yeah, I think what you said is, it depends upon how it goes. I'd be surprised if he's a top 10 pick after this season, just based on the way last season went. And I think if he is a top 10 pick, that means good things for Penn State. And I think that's what you want. You want to have a really big season where you make a lot of noise with him. I think the other flip side is what happens if he's not a draft caliber quarterback by the end of the season, or a high draft caliber quarterback. How does that affect Penn State's decision making, moving forward? So that's certainly an interesting storyline to monitor. Wanted to get into the cornerbacks a little bit too. Franklin, I was reading the transcript again, so I didn't get the tone of voice, but he seemed to be feeling a little froggy about that group. He mentioned Cam Miller, Zion Tracey, Audavion Collins, AJ Harris, Elliot Washington, Jalen Kimber's 6 guys that he feels good about. I think that would come as a bit of a shock to people who watched the Peach Bowl, and frankly, who watched Penn State's corners in a lot of these big games over, recent seasons. I don't think it's a question, with Penn State's cornerbacks, like, can you guys cover the guys from Purdue? Can you cover the guys from West Virginia? Can you cover the guys, maybe from Minnesota? I think they've answered that question. I think there's a reasonable level of confidence that you have that those guys are going to be good in those situations. But when it comes to facing, some of the best receivers in college football, how do you feel about that group, just based on what we saw toward the end of last season?
Yeah, it's interesting because all the watch lists are starting to come out now, and the Jim Thorpe watch list came out, and I think it was the first year in like 4 or 5 years that Penn State didn't have anyone listed, and that's the best defensive back in college football. And there were I think it was 42 players who were on that preseason watch list, and Penn State didn't have a single one of them, which is interesting to me. But I mean, you kind of look into it, and it's, maybe who does Penn State have that's kind of a proven superstar, because you're kind of banking on a guy like maybe AJ Harris being that guy as a former 5-star and everything like that, a Georgia transfer. But again, he only played in, I think it was 6 or 7 games last year with Georgia as a true freshman. And so there's not that much film. He didn't get any starts or anything like that. And so if you were to put him up there, you'd just be kind of banking on the talent. So there's really no proven commodities in this room, I would say. But there are a lot of guys that have the potential to, by season's end, be one of the top defensive backs in the country. I thought Audavion Collins is an interesting guy just because we didn't really see him much last year. And Franklin said that Franklin actually for the second time has gone out of his way to praise Audavion Collins, because usually it's a reporter asks him, who's a player that stood out, and then he'll name someone. But this was more of an unprompted situation where he kind of brought up Audavion Collins on his own, which is the second time he's done this, and said he's a guy that's kind of under the radar right now. And he actually, kind of gestured to the media and said, I don't think you guys have really been talking about him enough or as much as you should be, which is interesting. So I think that he's a guy who could push for, some solid playing time. I don't know if he gets a starting role necessarily, but he should be a contributor this year. And I think he's going to be better than a lot of people think. And he's kind of a guy that people forgot about after, he transferred in last offseason and then didn't play much. But yeah, I think he's a guy who's kind of ready to break out, even if it's not in a starting role.
Any individual conversations that you were in, Joel, that impressed you, stood out to you, that you think are worth raising? Because that's kind of the magic of media days. Like guys like me who are in Pittsburgh, we can read the transcripts, see what Franklin said, see what the coordinator said, but only guys like you who are on the ground at State College can actually talk to these players individually, and kind of see where things stand with them. So what were the highlights for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the more interesting things, and something that I kind of picked up on early during Franklin's press conference and during Kotelnicki's press conference, and then I kind of pulled on that thread a bit and went to the players and kind of asked them about it, was just the competitiveness and the chippiness at practice. I mean, and I got to talk to Terry Smith, not at Penn State Media Day, but earlier this summer about this. And he kind of said that, last season, Penn State with one of the top defenses, arguably the top defense in the country, going against a mediocre offense, was always dominating during practice. And then we saw this summer and even into fall camp now with a few days down that the offense has been kind of holding its own against the defense, which is really interesting. You can argue whether it's the defense regressing after losing like 6 or 7 starters to the NFL. You could argue that it's the offense making strides under Kotelnicki. But regardless of how you slice it, I mean, I talked to the wide receivers about it, and they said, they're excited. And Liam Clifford had a really interesting quote to me. He said, every day at practice, we get to go against the best secondary in the country. Well, we want to be the best wide receiver room in the country, and we feel like we can be that, which was really, really interesting to hear because it sounds like the wide receivers have been matching up well. And we actually heard that there's been some chippiness between the two sides at practice, something that wasn't necessarily there in the past. And I think Kotelnicki is kind of the fuse that's kind of lighting that, because we actually heard that Kotelnicki has started to chirp the defense whenever the offense does something good against them, whether it's one-on-ones or just scrimmages, things like that. But Kotelnicki is kind of bringing that fire, that competitive edge, and the offense is really kind of growing under him and pushing the defense a bit more at practice than we've seen in the past. And we keep hearing the phrase "iron sharpens iron." I mean, that was kind of the quote that kept popping up, the phrase that kept popping up throughout media from a bunch of different players, pretty much everyone that you talk to.
Interesting. It'll be certainly interesting to keep an eye on that as we get into these last weeks of the off season here before games start on Labor Day weekend. Were you surprised the AP coaches poll came out this week? Penn State was number 9, or not the AP coaches poll, just the regular coaches poll came out, and Penn State was ranked number 9. They were behind Michigan at number 8. A lot of people have Penn State higher in the pecking order in the media world. It's been a lot of, some combination of Ohio State and Oregon, 1, 2, and then Penn State 3, Michigan, somewhere 4, sometimes a little bit lower. Were you surprised to see the coaches holding Michigan in such high regard? Or is that just the byproduct of they've won the national championship and they've beaten Penn State in big games 3 years in a row?
Right. Yeah. I mean, me personally, I'm putting Penn State above Michigan if I were a voter, but I can kind of understand why they did it. And I actually saw that Michigan had one first place vote from one of the coaches, which was kind of funny, which I guess is obviously just based on the national championship last year. So I think the voters are kind of mixed on what they're ranking the teams based off. I think some of them are projecting into this year, and then some of them are kind of basing their ranking off of last year's success. Because like I said, that number 1 vote that Michigan got, just one voter put them at first place, which kind of tells me that a lot of people are basing their voting off of how Michigan performed last year, or at least a few people are. And I think that's kind of dragging Michigan's average, or pulling Michigan's average a little bit higher than it would be. So yeah, heading into this year, I think Penn State should be favored against Michigan. I think if you're Penn State, you're kind of mad that you missed out on Michigan this year on the schedule, just because, this would have been probably your best chance to beat them in the last few years. So a little bit surprising to me, and I wouldn't have had it that way. But again, I can understand where kind of some of the coaches are coming from with that, just based on what they did last year. But personally, I would have Michigan probably closer to that 12 range. And then as far as Penn State, I think 9 overall is a pretty fair ranking as well.
The first question James Franklin was asked in his press conference on Saturday was actually about the House settlement and how that is changing roster construction in college football, college sports broadly, but just specific to this conversation, college football. It's now a roster limit of 105. And I think they're now giving more leeway in terms of passing out scholarships, because the scholarship limit was 85, but now you have a roster limit of 105, and then the programs can decide kind of between 85 and 105 what they're going to do. James Franklin demurred on the question of what Penn State's going to do. It's a relatively recent thing. Not surprising that he doesn't have a hard and fast answer. I think my question for you, Joel, is Penn State's NIL and donor base going to be able to support Penn State having 105 football scholarships? They're going to be able to support 95. Are they interested? Because I think that's the huge question about Penn State football moving forward, beyond any of the players and the coaches, is what is the level of alumni support going to be? It's the largest dues-paying alumni association in the world. They love to say that, during the intermissions at football games when they're touting, membership in the Nittany Lion Club and all of that. But Penn State's been playing catch-up in NIL in a lot of areas. I think they've made a lot of encouraging progress. I think there's people involved now in the NIL collective, in the NIL space, who get it, who understand that Penn State needs to invest in that spot to, succeed in modern college football. But I think there was the one donor drive where Penn State was trying to raise $1 million, and it took them longer, and they had fewer donors than Michigan. Does there need to be, a philosophical change if Penn State's going to be able to get that depth that James Franklin loves to talk about depth? If you read his transcripts and you follow his press conferences, depth is always something he's talking about. He feels good about the depth going into this season. Probably the first time I've actually seen him say something that confident. But the next level of depth is going to be adding these scholarships. Joel, do you think that the Penn State has the appetite to support him in that way and cultivate a deeper roster than maybe they had when that 85 to 105 was filled mostly by run-ons?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that makes our job a lot harder because we now have to memorize 105 names and numbers and things like that, write more stories about them, everything like that. And then obviously you've got a quarter of them leaving every year and coming back in. So it'll make our lives harder for sure. But to get to your question, will Penn State be able to sustain it? I think so, because I believe, and I could be wrong here, but I believe the scholarship money comes from the football program and kind of the money it raises from ticket revenue and merch revenue and things like that. And it won't be based on the NIL revenue, which Penn State has obviously been behind in. So I think that honestly plays into Penn State's favor because that athletic department obviously has a lot of money. I mean, they just approved the $700 million renovations to Beaver Stadium. So obviously they've got, a good chunk of change there. I think they'll be able to afford the extra 20 scholarships. And we saw that actually, I think this benefits Penn State because we saw that there were teams around the country who were basically using their NIL money to pay for scholarships to have, an expanded roster. There were schools that were basically just paying their walk-ons a full scholarship using NIL. And now Penn State will be able to do that without NIL. They'll be able to do it with just the athletics department money. Because, I mean, like you mentioned, Penn State's NIL has been, far behind its competitors. I meant to ask James Franklin about that actually at Penn State Media Day, but they don't like to give student reporters questions when it comes to Franklin. So I made an attempt, but unfortunately wasn't given the shot. But I mean, I can even pull up the numbers right now for Penn State's Retain the Roar campaign, which launched, I believe they timed it with the spring transfer portal window opening, which was, clever timing because that's when your players are going to be kind of hitting the portal and looking for better NIL opportunities. But I mean, I can pull it up right now and see what number it's at. But we saw from Ohio State, Ryan Day actually said at Big Ten Media Days a couple weeks ago that Ohio State spent roughly $20 million in NIL this year. And then you look at Penn State, who launched this Retain the Roar campaign in the spring with a goal of $500,000. So 1/40th of what Ohio State made was their goal. And I can pull it up on my phone right now. They're currently at $363,000. So they have not hit their goal of $500,000, while Ohio State has spent $20 million just this year on NIL. So if that kind of tells you where Penn State sits in terms of NIL, I think this is a move that benefits them just because now they're able to use that athletic funding, which they do have more of, because I think Penn State's donors are more old school, where they're going to, give the program money through kind of the athletics program through buying merchandise and tickets and things like that, and not necessarily just a straight up NIL donation.
Yeah, the problem with that, Joel, is that you can't it depends upon how things play out with the House settlement. And I think, to your point, Penn State will be in terms of being able to pay out directly. And I think ideally, that's where this shouldn't be happening through NIL. You should be if you're going to pay players, it should be going through the athletic departments, through those budgets, and not through, individual donors. But that's where we are now. And I just wonder if, when it comes to not just getting those guys on the roster and getting good players on the roster, but getting the high quality impact guys, if Penn State's going to, have the donor base to use those scholarships in the way that you'd like to, and getting guys some combination of here's your scholarship, here's what we're able to pay you through the House settlement, and then here's what we're able to pay you through NIL. I think, to your point, Penn State's probably in decent shape with two of those things, but the third one, it's going to be interesting to see, what the appetite is with a lot of those Joe Pa acolytes who just do not like to open the wallet for anything, related to pay for play. It's going to take a while to change the philosophy. I'll be interested to see how that plays out. Joel, any other things you wanted to touch on before we signed off for the week here and, kind of start to pivot into, deep fall camp and really looking toward the season?
Nothing that we haven't really touched on, but just to kind of reiterate, I do think my biggest takeaway has just been the improvement that Penn State's offense has been able to make under Kotelnicki, and just the way that they've been able to challenge the offense this year, which I think will be unusual for Penn State. Just looking at it historically, it's a school that typically relies on its defense as the stronger unit. I don't know when was the last time the offense was really, rated higher than the defense, maybe the Saquon Barkley years, things like that. So you might have to go back a little while to find the last time that happened. And I think this year there's a decent shot that Penn State's offense will actually be the stronger unit. So that'll be something interesting to watch out for.
Well, stay tuned, everyone. I will be back later today on Friday. Paul Zeiss and I will recap the Steelers' first preseason game against the Houston Texans. We'll be streaming live, so make sure you're subscribed. Then we'll be back all next week. Christopher Carter on the North Shore Drive, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I'll be back with Paul Zeiss on Thursday. I think we might have the return of Chip Tam and football with Brian Batko. He's been up at camp on Tuesday, so it's been kind of hard to line up guests and interviews. So we've just kind of focused on what's been going on at training camp. But we're going to get Brian back on that Tuesday schedule as well. So lots of good stuff coming your way. Joel, thanks for joining me. Looking forward to talking to you again next week.
Yep, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.